Wilhelm II's own cousin warned him, "You're going to start a war that will destroy everything we've built." He laughed it off. 3 years later, 17 million people were dead, 4 empires had collapsed, and the world would never be the same. This is the story of the man who had everything and threw it all away because he couldn't stand being second to anyone. Here's what nobody tells you about Wilhelm II. He didn't want war. He actually hesitated multiple times. But he had surrounded himself with generals who told him exactly what he wanted to hear, dismissed every voice of caution as weakness, and convinced himself that showing restraint would make him look like a coward. So when the moment came to pull back from the brink, he couldn't do it. His ego wouldn't let him. And that single psychological trap, that one moment of pride overriding judgment, set off a chain reaction that killed more people than every European war in the previous 100 years combined. You're going to see the exact moments where he could have changed course. The telegrams he ignored, the advisors he fired for telling him the truth, the personal rivalries he let poison his strategic thinking. And you're going to recognize these patterns because they're everywhere. In companies that collapse because the CEO can't admit he's wrong. In relationships that implode because someone needs to win every argument. In your own decisions when ego whispers that backing down equals losing. Wilhelm II had more information, more resources, and more smart people around him than almost any leader in history, and he still managed to make the worst decision possible. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because he lacked the one thing that actually matters when you have power. The ability to hear what you don't want to hear. This isn't a history lesson. This is a dissection of how talented, ambitious, capable people talk themselves into catastrophic mistakes while convinced they're doing the right thing. And if you think you're immune to it, you're already halfway there. Wilhelm II was born on January 27, 1859, at the Kronprinzenpalais in Berlin, as the firstborn son of Crown Prince Frederick William of Prussia and Princess Victoria of the United Kingdom. As the first grandchild of the formidable Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, he embodied the dynastic union between the British and Prussian monarchies, representing a powerful alliance between two of Europe's most influential royal houses. However, his role in the German succession carried even greater significance. From 1861 onward, he became second in line to the Prussian throne, and with the momentous unification of Germany in 1871 under Bismarck's leadership, he simultaneously became heir apparent to the newly established German Empire. Beyond his exceptionally privileged position within the Hohenzollern dynasty, Wilhelm possessed extensive blood ties to nearly all of European aristocracy, forming part of an intricate web of royal kinship that connected the continent's ruling families. Prior to the outbreak of the First World War, he maintained notably close relationships with his cousins, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and King George V of the United Kingdom, though his relationship with his own parents remained deeply troubled and fraught with tension, characterized by persistent coldness, emotional distance, and mutual disdain that would shape his psychological development. His birth, however, was severely complicated and left profound and lasting marks on both his physical condition and psychological state. He entered the world in a breech position, resulting in an exceptionally difficult and traumatic delivery that caused Erb's palsy, a nerve injury that permanently affected his left arm and compromised its functionality. The atrophied limb remained approximately 15 centimeters shorter than his right arm, a conspicuous physical asymmetry and source of profound embarrassment that Wilhelm attempted to conceal and disguise throughout his entire life with meticulous attention to detail. In official photographs and public appearances, he frequently employed various tactics to mask his disability, holding gloves in his left hand, leaning prominently on a sword or ceremonial weapon, or strategically positioning his hand on his hip or behind objects to disguise the noticeable disparity and avoid drawing attention to his impairment. Many historians and biographers suggest that this physical limitation profoundly influenced his psychological development, character formation, and deep-seated insecurities that manifested throughout his reign. From early childhood, Wilhelm endured a grueling regimen of painful and often humiliating treatments specifically designed to correct the condition, including forced exercises, aggressive physiotherapy sessions, and even experimental procedures that caused considerable physical discomfort and emotional distress. His mother, Princess Victoria, a woman of distinctly British upbringing and progressive liberal sensibilities who sought to instill cosmopolitan values in her son, firmly believed that a rigorous, disciplined education combined with physical conditioning could strengthen her son and compensate for his disability. However, rather than cultivating a confident, emotionally secure and balanced leader capable of nuanced diplomacy, the relentless pressure, harsh treatment methods, and emotional neglect only served to deepen his psychological trauma, foster resentment, and contribute to the development of an insecure, volatile personality marked by compensatory aggression and an obsessive need to prove his strength and masculinity. From the age of 6, Wilhelm II began receiving a rigorous and demanding education under the tutelage of Georg Hinzpeter, an exceptionally strict and austere educator who regarded discipline as the fundamental key to transforming the young prince into a strong, authoritative leader. Subsequently, he pursued his studies at the prestigious Friedrichsgymnasium in Kassel, and later at the University of Bonn, where he joined the Corps Borussia, a distinguished student association that reinforced his connections to the Prussian aristocratic elite. Intellectually gifted and possessing a quick analytical mind, Wilhelm absorbed knowledge with remarkable ease and demonstrated considerable aptitude across various subjects. However, his difficult temperament and pronounced emotional instability frequently overshadowed and undermined his genuine intellectual capabilities. He proved unable to accept criticism constructively, responding defensively to any challenges to his ideas, and displayed marked impatience with teachings or perspectives that did not align with his own firmly held beliefs and preconceptions. Raised within the insular world of the Prussian aristocracy, Wilhelm lived from his youth among the military elite, absorbing and internalizing the rigid, hierarchical values of the martial culture that dominated Prussian society. As he matured, he became increasingly obsessed with military symbolism, pageantry, and tradition, to the extent that he was rarely seen in public without wearing his military uniform, which became virtually his daily attire regardless of the occasion. For Wilhelm, dressing as a soldier transcended mere protocol or ceremonial requirement. It represented a constant, visible demonstration of strength, masculinity, and imperial authority that compensated for his physical insecurities. His Prussian military formation profoundly shaped not only his political ideology and worldview, but also his personal relationships, rendering him inflexible, domineering, and deeply suspicious of those who did not share his expansionist, militaristic vision for Germany's future role as a dominant European power. His relationship with his father, Crown Prince Frederick, was initially marked by respect, admiration, and even veneration. Wilhelm viewed him as a heroic figure from the wars of German unification, and for many years cultivated an idealized, romanticized image of his paternal figure as a warrior and statesman. However, as years passed, and under the growing influence of conservative circles within the court, who sought to manipulate the impressionable prince, he began to distance himself emotionally and politically from his father. His deliberate alignment with his father's political adversaries led him to question Frederick's authority and to regard him as weak, ineffectual, and unsuited for leadership, particularly due to his more liberal political stance and his close, affectionate relationship with Wilhelm's mother, whom the prince increasingly resented. While he idolized his grandfather, Wilhelm I, and actively worked to construct an elaborate cult of personality around his figure as Wilhelm the Great, portraying him as the architect of German unity and greatness, Wilhelm II increasingly viewed his own father as merely a pale shadow of that perceived grandeur, which deepened his contempt for the progressive, constitutionalist ideas that Frederick represented and championed. Beyond the intense political pressure and bitter family disputes that characterized his formative years, Wilhelm also carried a troubling genetic heritage that cast a shadow over his mental stability. Ancestors from both sides of his family demonstrated documented histories of mental illness, psychological disorders, and emotional instability, factors that may have significantly contributed to his own pronounced emotional volatility, erratic behavior, and impulsive decision-making patterns. This vulnerability was skillfully and cynically exploited by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the architect of German unification, who quickly recognized that he could manipulate Wilhelm as an instrument to undermine and weaken the political influence of the prince's own parents, whom Bismarck viewed as threats to his power. The calculating chancellor systematically encouraged the young prince to distance himself from his mother's influence, to reject the liberal, Anglophile ideas that both his parents championed, and to embrace a more authoritarian, conservative ideology, thereby deliberately widening the already existing chasm between Wilhelm and his family. Consequently, Wilhelm began to harbor deep, bitter resentments, particularly toward his mother, whom he irrationally blamed not only for his physical deformity and the painful treatments he endured, but also for his psychological suffering, emotional instability, and perceived humiliations, creating a toxic familial dynamic that would profoundly affect his reign and personal relationships throughout his life. Wilhelm II ascended to the throne of the German Empire in 1888, a year marked by dramatic and abrupt changes within the Prussian monarchy that would later be remembered as the Year of the Three Emperors. His grandfather, Wilhelm I, died in March, leaving the crown to Frederick III, who, suffering from advanced laryngeal cancer that had severely compromised his health, succumbed to the disease after reigning for merely 99 days, one of the shortest reigns in German history. Thus, at only 29 years of age, Wilhelm found himself elevated to the position of German Emperor and King of Prussia, carrying with him ambitious expectations of consolidating Germany's status as a preeminent global power capable of rivaling the established British and French empires. However, despite his youthful vigor, boundless energy, and genuine enthusiasm for his new role, his volatile temperament, impulsive nature, and stubborn resistance to counsel and advice from experienced statesmen ensured that his early years on the throne were characterized by hasty, ill-considered decisions and escalating political tensions both domestically and internationally. At the beginning of his reign, Wilhelm retained Otto von Bismarck as imperial chancellor, initially respecting and acknowledging the extraordinary legacy of the master statesman who had orchestrated German unification through a brilliant combination of diplomatic maneuvering and calculated military campaigns. Nevertheless, this uneasy alliance deteriorated rapidly and irreparably within a remarkably short period. Bismarck, who had grown accustomed to governing with virtually absolute control over German domestic and foreign policy for nearly 3 decades, regarded Wilhelm as an impetuous, inexperienced young ruler who was fundamentally difficult to manage and dangerously prone to erratic decision-making. The emperor, for his part, felt increasingly suffocated and constrained by the chancellor's dominating presence and overwhelming influence, and he ardently desired to assume complete, unmediated control of his government, seeking to establish his own legacy independent of Bismarck's shadow. The clash of personalities and governing philosophies was inevitable and irreconcilable. Wilhelm envisioned an empire that would aggressively project German power across the world through colonial expansion, naval supremacy, and assertive diplomacy, while Bismarck remained a consummate master of cautious, calculated diplomacy, deliberately avoiding direct conflicts with other major powers and employing intricate alliance systems designed to maintain a delicate balance of power that preserved Germany's security and European stability. The tensions escalated even further over fundamental disagreements in domestic policy and the handling of internal challenges. Bismarck had governed with an iron fist, systematically repressing the growing socialist movement through the implementation of restrictive anti-socialist laws that banned their organizations, publications, and public activities, viewing social democracy as an existential threat to the established order. However, Wilhelm II, despite his conservative instincts and aristocratic background, believed that a more flexible, conciliatory approach was necessary to address the legitimate grievances of the working classes and prevent revolutionary upheaval. The young emperor sought to win the loyalty and support of German workers through social reforms and paternalistic welfare measures, positioning himself as a social emperor who cared for all his subjects, while the entrenched chancellor adamantly insisted that any meaningful concessions to socialism represented an unacceptable risk to monarchical authority and would only embolden radical elements. In 1890, the simmering conflict reached its dramatic climax when Bismarck attempted to reinstate and strengthen repressive measures against socialist organizations without properly consulting Wilhelm or securing his explicit approval. The emperor, deeply indignant at what he perceived as the chancellor's calculated maneuver to circumvent his authority and maintain his own independent power base, recognized in this confrontation the perfect opportunity to definitively assert his imperial prerogatives, consolidate his personal authority over the German government, setting the stage for Bismarck's forced resignation and ushering in the era of Wilhelm's personal rule. Wilhelm II ascended to the throne of the German Empire in 1888, a year marked by dramatic and abrupt changes within the Prussian monarchy that would later be remembered as the Year of the Three Emperors. His grandfather, Wilhelm I, died in March, leaving the crown to Frederick III, who, suffering from advanced laryngeal cancer that had severely compromised his health, succumbed to the disease after reigning for merely 99 days, one of the shortest reigns in German history. Thus, at only 29 years of age, Wilhelm found himself elevated to the position of German Emperor and King of Prussia, carrying with him ambitious expectations of consolidating Germany's status as a preeminent global power capable of rivaling the established British and French empires. However, despite his youthful vigor, boundless energy, and genuine enthusiasm for his new role, his volatile temperament, impulsive nature, and stubborn resistance to counsel and advice from experienced statesmen ensured that his early years on the throne were characterized by hasty, ill-considered decisions and escalating political tensions both domestically and internationally. At the beginning of his reign, Wilhelm retained Otto von Bismarck as imperial chancellor, initially respecting and acknowledging the extraordinary legacy of the master statesman who had orchestrated German unification through a brilliant combination of diplomatic maneuvering and calculated military campaigns. Nevertheless, this uneasy alliance deteriorated rapidly and irreparably within a remarkably short period. Bismarck, who had grown accustomed to governing with virtually absolute control over German domestic and foreign policy for nearly 3 decades, regarded Wilhelm as an impetuous, inexperienced young ruler who was fundamentally difficult to manage. The emperor, for his part, felt increasingly suffocated and constrained by the chancellor's dominating presence and overwhelming influence. He ardently desired to assume complete, unmediated control of his government, seeking to establish his own legacy independent of Bismarck's shadow. The clash of personalities and governing philosophies was inevitable and irreconcilable. Wilhelm envisioned an empire that would aggressively project German power across the world through colonial expansion, naval supremacy, and assertive diplomacy. Bismarck remained a consummate master of cautious, calculated diplomacy, deliberately avoiding direct conflicts with other major powers. He employed intricate alliance systems designed to maintain a delicate balance of power that preserved Germany's security and European stability. The tensions escalated even further over fundamental disagreements in domestic policy and the handling of internal challenges. Bismarck had governed with an iron fist, systematically repressing the growing socialist movement through the implementation of restrictive anti-socialist laws that banned their organizations, publications, and public activities. He viewed social democracy as an existential threat to the established order. However, Wilhelm II, despite his conservative instincts and aristocratic background, believed that a more flexible, conciliatory approach was necessary to address the legitimate grievances of the working classes. He sought to prevent revolutionary upheaval through reform, rather than repression. The young emperor sought to win the loyalty and support of German workers through social reforms and paternalistic welfare measures, positioning himself as a social emperor who cared for all his subjects. The entrenched chancellor adamantly insisted that any meaningful concessions to socialism represented an unacceptable risk to monarchical authority. He believed such measures would only embolden radical elements. In 1890, the simmering conflict reached its dramatic climax when Bismarck attempted to reinstate and strengthen repressive measures against socialist organizations without properly consulting Wilhelm or securing his explicit approval. The emperor, deeply indignant at what he perceived as the chancellor's calculated maneuver to circumvent his authority, recognized in this confrontation the perfect opportunity to definitively assert his imperial prerogatives. He moved decisively to consolidate his personal authority over the German government, setting the stage for Bismarck's forced resignation. This marked the beginning of the era of Wilhelm's personal rule. After consolidating his internal control, Wilhelm II turned his attention to foreign policy, determined to transform Germany into a formidable global power. His principal objective was to establish the empire as a dominant force capable of rivaling the United Kingdom and France on the world stage. To achieve this ambition, he adopted the Weltpolitik, world policy, an expansionist strategy that prioritized the construction of a powerful navy, the acquisition of colonial territories, and a more aggressive posture in international relations. However, unlike Bismarck, who had maintained a carefully calibrated diplomatic equilibrium through complex alliance systems, Wilhelm governed with impulsivity and without a coherent long-term strategy. He systematically accumulated enemies through tactless diplomacy. He progressively isolated Germany within the increasingly hostile European political landscape. One of the first major tests of the Weltpolitik came in 1905 with the First Moroccan Crisis. Wilhelm II made a highly publicized visit to Tangier. He declared his support for Moroccan independence, directly challenging French influence and ambitions in the region. The maneuver, rather than strengthening Germany's diplomatic position as intended, produced precisely the opposite effect. France, firmly backed by the United Kingdom through their recently established Entente Cordiale, resisted German pressure. French authorities reinforced their presence and control throughout the disputed territory. The episode culminated in the Conference of Algeciras in 1906, where Germany suffered a humiliating diplomatic setback. The majority of European powers aligned themselves against German interests, leaving Wilhelm diplomatically isolated. The Second Moroccan Crisis occurred in 1911, when Wilhelm ordered the deployment of the gunboat Panther to the Moroccan coast at Agadir, ostensibly to protect German commercial interests in the region. The movement was interpreted as a direct provocation. It generated enormous tension with the United Kingdom and France, both of which viewed the action as an unmistakable act of aggression and intimidation. Alarmed by Germany's increasingly bellicose behavior, London began investing even more heavily in naval expansion to maintain its maritime supremacy. The British government simultaneously reinforced its diplomatic and military ties with Paris, transforming the Entente into a more robust alliance. Wilhelm, instead of obtaining the diplomatic advantages and territorial concessions he sought, only succeeded in deepening the profound distrust between Germany and the rest of Europe. He accelerated the formation of the hostile coalition that would eventually confront Germany. Beyond the Moroccan crises, Wilhelm attempted to expand German influence throughout Asia and Africa through various diplomatic and commercial initiatives. His efforts were consistently frustrated by determined British and French resistance. The German Empire possessed several colonies in Africa, including Togoland, Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, and German East Africa. These territories remained strategically fragile and economically insignificant when compared to the vast and profitable colonial empire controlled by Britain. The Kaiser desperately wanted more territory and international prestige. He lacked the military means and diplomatic finesse to conquer new territories without triggering a catastrophic European war. His grandiose desire for global projection contrasted sharply with the reality of a Germany increasingly surrounded by hostile alliances. The empire lacked effective diplomacy, capable of expanding its sphere of influence through peaceful means. Ultimately, Wilhelm II's Weltpolitik ended in abject failure. In attempting to transform Germany into an imperialist power with truly global reach, he only succeeded in alienating potential allies. He strengthened cooperation and coordination among Germany's adversaries, inadvertently creating the very encirclement he feared most. Wilhelm II's foreign policy was marked not only by military actions and diplomatic maneuvers, but also by his impulsive speeches, which frequently generated international crises. The emperor had a troubling habit of speaking without considering the consequences. He inflamed tensions repeatedly. He systematically damaged Germany's reputation on the global stage. Two of the most emblematic episodes demonstrating his lack of diplomatic filter were the Hun speech in 1900 and the Daily Telegraph affair in 1908. Both incidents reinforced the widespread perception that Wilhelm was an unpredictable and erratic leader. He became a significant liability both for Germany's allies and for his own ministers, who struggled to contain the diplomatic damage caused by his indiscretions. The first scandal occurred during the Boxer Rebellion, a violent uprising in China against foreign influence and the presence of Western powers. As part of the international coalition dispatched to suppress the rebels and protect foreign nationals, Germany sent a substantial military contingent. Before the departure of German troops, Wilhelm delivered an incendiary speech on July 27, 1900, at the port of Bremerhaven. He ordered German soldiers to show no mercy whatsoever toward the Chinese insurgents. He explicitly exhorted the troops to follow the example of Attila the Hun, who, according to medieval legend, had terrorized Europe through brutal conquest. His exact words were inflammatory. Just as 1,000 years ago the Huns made their name resonate with glory and terror, so you must establish the German name in China in such a way that no Chinese will ever again dare to look at a German with contempt. The speech, which was intended to serve as military motivation and inspiration, was received internationally as a brutal and explicitly racist threat. The term Hun immediately began to be used by the British and French as a derogatory insult against Germans. This epithet gained particular prominence during the First World War as anti-German propaganda. Furthermore, his words severely damaged Germany's diplomatic efforts throughout Asia. They increased the profound distrust of Western powers regarding the true intentions and ultimate ambitions of the German Empire. Wilhelm already possessed a well-established reputation for being impulsive and temperamental. The Hun speech definitively consolidated the international perception that he was an irresponsible leader, fundamentally incapable of measuring or understanding the far-reaching impact of his own inflammatory declarations. The second major scandal arrived in 1908 with the controversial interview granted to the British newspaper Daily Telegraph. Wilhelm believed he could improve Germany's tarnished image in the United Kingdom by candidly expressing his genuine feelings about Anglo-German relations and demonstrating his personal affection for Britain. However, his statements proved diplomatically disastrous. During the interview, he asserted that Germans were the only true friends that the British possessed. He claimed that many Germans genuinely admired England and its institutions. Nevertheless, simultaneously and contradictorily, he accused the British population of being irrationally hostile toward Germany without legitimate cause. He arrogantly suggested that the German military could easily defeat any potential enemy, including by implication the British Empire itself. One of Wilhelm II's greatest and most consuming obsessions was transforming Germany into a formidable naval power capable of rivaling and potentially surpassing the United Kingdom's long-established maritime supremacy. Fascinated by warships and naval technology since his youth, particularly during his visits to Britain, where he witnessed the might of the Royal Navy firsthand, he became convinced that maritime power was absolutely essential for consolidating Germany's status as a legitimate global empire with worldwide influence and commercial reach. Thus, beginning in the 1890s, he initiated an extraordinarily ambitious and costly naval construction program led by the brilliant but controversial Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who shared the Kaiser's vision of German naval greatness. The underlying strategic idea was to create a battle fleet capable of directly challenging the Royal Navy's centuries-old dominance of the seas. This massive undertaking became one of the principal factors in the dramatic escalation of tensions between the two nations, fundamentally altering the European balance of power. Wilhelm viewed the naval race as a potent symbol of national prestige, imperial power, and Germany's rightful place among the world's greatest powers. However, his aggressive naval strategy only succeeded in pushing the United Kingdom, which had previously maintained a policy of splendid isolation from continental entanglements, decisively closer to France and Russia. He inadvertently strengthened the very diplomatic and military alliances that would ultimately encircle and isolate Germany strategically on the eve of the First World War, creating the precise geopolitical nightmare that Bismarck had worked so meticulously to prevent. The crucial turning point in German naval expansion occurred in 1898 when Tirpitz, leveraging nationalist sentiment and appealing to German pride, successfully convinced the Reichstag to approve the first naval law despite significant opposition from fiscal conservatives. This landmark legislation established the ambitious objective of constructing a modern fleet of capital battleships capable of projecting German power across the world's oceans and protecting the nation's growing colonial possessions and commercial interests. In 1900, exploiting the patriotic fervor generated by the Boxer Rebellion and Germany's participation in the international expedition to China, a second naval law was approved with even broader support. This legislation effectively doubled the number of ships planned in the original program. It guaranteed continuous, substantial investments in the development and expansion of the Navy for the foreseeable future, committing Germany to decades of expensive naval construction. Wilhelm enthusiastically and publicly supported this ambitious plan with unwavering determination. He remained firmly convinced that if Germany possessed a fleet sufficiently powerful and numerous to pose a credible threat to British naval supremacy, the United Kingdom would be strategically compelled to respect German interests and accommodate German ambitions. He naively believed that such a risk fleet would ultimately force London to accept a diplomatic alliance, or at least a negotiated understanding with Berlin, viewing naval parity as the key to breaking Germany's diplomatic isolation. However, British political leaders, military strategists, and naval experts perceived the rapid and aggressive expansion of the Imperial German Navy as a direct, unambiguous, and existential threat to their maritime dominance, which formed the very foundation of British imperial power and economic prosperity. They responded decisively by intensifying their own naval construction efforts through expanded budgets and accelerated building programs. This British reaction triggered a fierce, economically draining, and ultimately unsustainable arms race between the two industrial powers that consumed vast resources and poisoned diplomatic relations for over a decade. The greatest and most iconic symbol of this escalating naval rivalry was the revolutionary British battleship HMS Dreadnought, launched with great fanfare in 1906 and representing a quantum leap in naval technology. Revolutionary in terms of its all-big gun armament configuration, unprecedented speed achieved through turbine propulsion, and sophisticated armor plating using advanced metallurgy, it rendered all previous warships, including Britain's own extensive fleet, technologically obsolete virtually overnight. It effectively reset the naval balance and forced Germany to fundamentally reconsider and restructure its entire naval construction program. Wilhelm II, rather than being discouraged by this technological breakthrough, did not hesitate to increase military spending even further, despite growing budgetary constraints and domestic political opposition. He personally approved the construction of an entire series of Dreadnought-class battleships specifically designed to match or exceed British specifications, pouring enormous financial resources into this competitive endeavor. However, regardless of how much Germany invested in the expansion of its navy, how many shipyards it constructed, or how many skilled workers it trained, the United Kingdom consistently maintained a decisive strategic advantage that Germany could never overcome. British economic resources, derived from the world's largest empire and most developed financial system, were substantially greater and more sustainable. British industrial capacity, particularly in shipbuilding, remained unmatched. British naval experience, accumulated and refined over centuries of maritime dominance, global naval operations, and institutional knowledge passed down through generations of professional sailors, proved far superior to Germany's relatively recent and hastily developed naval ambitions. Wilhelm's elaborate plan, rather than securing the alliance, diplomatic understanding, or even basic mutual respect with the British that he so desperately craved, only succeeded in deepening the mutual distrust, suspicion, and outright hostility between the two countries. It accelerated Britain's diplomatic alignment with Germany's continental rivals, particularly France through the Entente Cordiale of 1904, and Russia through the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, thereby creating the Triple Entente that would confront Germany in the coming World War. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist and member of the Black Hand organization. This assassination triggered a diplomatic crisis that rapidly evolved into a global conflict of unprecedented scale. Wilhelm II, then Emperor of Germany, played a decisive and controversial role in this catastrophic process. Initially, he significantly underestimated the political impact and potential consequences of the assassination, dismissing it as a localized Balkan issue. However, pressured by his Austrian allies who demanded German support for retaliatory action against Serbia, Wilhelm offered unconditional backing to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This pledge became known as the infamous blank check, essentially giving Vienna carte blanche to pursue whatever aggressive policies it deemed necessary, without fear of losing German support. Armed with this assurance of German support, Austro-Hungarian authorities held Serbia directly responsible for the assassination, claiming the attack was orchestrated by Serbian military intelligence. They adopted an increasingly aggressive and uncompromising posture toward Belgrade. Wilhelm, who had been vacationing on his yacht in Norwegian waters to maintain an appearance of normalcy, only fully comprehended the gravity of the escalating situation upon his return to Berlin in late July. Even at this late stage, he made some genuine attempts to mediate a diplomatic solution that might prevent a wider European war. He proposed a limited punitive action against Serbia, suggesting that Austrian forces might occupy Belgrade temporarily as a show of force while negotiations continued. His goal was to satisfy Austrian honor while simultaneously avoiding the intervention of Russia, which had historically positioned itself as the protector of Slavic nations in the Balkans. However, the German High Command, particularly the Chief of the General Staff Helmuth von Moltke and other influential military figures, already favored a broader military confrontation. They viewed the crisis as an opportune moment to wage a preventive war against Russia and France before these nations grew even stronger. They systematically undermined Wilhelm's more moderate diplomatic efforts. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary presented a deliberately harsh ultimatum to Serbia, containing 10 demands that fundamentally violated Serbian sovereignty and independence. Although the Serbian government, desperate to avoid war and advised by Russia to be conciliatory, accepted nearly all of the conditions in a remarkably accommodating response, the Austrians, actively encouraged by the most bellicose sectors within the Berlin government and military establishment, rejected any possibility of negotiated settlement or compromise. They dismissed Serbia's response as insufficient. Vienna declared war on Serbia on July 28th, exactly 1 month after the Archduke's assassination. The subsequent Russian military mobilization in support of their Serbian allies, which the Tsar authorized reluctantly under enormous domestic pressure from pan-Slavist factions, dramatically intensified the diplomatic deadlock and activated the complex web of European alliance systems. Wilhelm, increasingly alarmed by the rapid deterioration of the situation and the prospect of a two-front war, attempted a final personal appeal to his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, through a series of urgent telegrams known as the Willy-Nicky correspondence. However, the internal pressures within both countries, the rigid mobilization schedules demanded by military planning, and the momentum of events had already made war virtually inevitable. Neither monarch possessed sufficient authority or political will to overrule their respective military establishments and nationalist political factions. On August 1, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia, claiming that Russian mobilization constituted an act of aggression that left Berlin no choice but to respond militarily. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France, Russia's ally, preemptively implementing the long-planned Schlieffen Plan that called for a rapid knockout blow against France before turning east to face Russia. The following day, German troops invaded Belgium, blatantly violating that nation's internationally guaranteed neutrality in order to outflank French fortifications along the Franco-German border. This violation of Belgian neutrality provided Britain with the legal and moral justification it needed to overcome domestic political divisions. London declared war on Germany on August 4th, honoring its treaty obligations to Belgium. Thus, the chain of events unleashed by the assassination in Sarajevo, amplified by Wilhelm's reckless blank check, rigid alliance systems, inflexible military mobilization schedules, and the failure of diplomacy, culminated in the catastrophic beginning of the First World War. This conflict would ultimately claim millions of lives, destroy 4 empires, and fundamentally reshape the political, social, and economic landscape of the entire world. When the First World War commenced in August 1914, Wilhelm II still firmly believed that the conflict would be brief and glorious for Germany, confidently predicting that his soldiers would be home before the leaves fall. However, as the war progressed and battles became increasingly brutal, protracted, and devastating, the Kaiser gradually lost power within his own empire. The military leadership, headed by commanding figures such as Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff, systematically began to assume control over the principal strategic and political decisions. Meanwhile, Wilhelm was increasingly reduced to a mere figurehead. His constitutional role as supreme commander of the armed forces became, in practice, purely symbolic and ceremonial, devoid of any real authority or meaningful influence over military operations. In the opening months of the war, Wilhelm still attempted to exercise some degree of influence over military strategies and operational decisions, attending planning meetings and offering his opinions on various campaigns. However, his fundamental lack of technical military knowledge, his tendency toward emotional decision-making, and his increasingly inconsistent judgments caused the professional generals to rapidly and decisively assume complete control over all significant matters. The Kaiser, who had always enjoyed presenting himself as an imposing military leader, dressing constantly in elaborate uniforms and surrounding himself with martial pageantry, was progressively and deliberately sidelined from actual operational decisions. He was transformed into a mere spectator, observing the actions of the high command from a distance. While Ludendorff and Hindenburg directed the course of the war on both the eastern and western fronts, making critical decisions about troop deployments, offensive operations, and strategic priorities, Wilhelm was relegated to signing official decrees prepared by others, making carefully scripted public appearances designed to maintain civilian morale, and performing ceremonial duties that held no substantive importance. The prolonged war fundamentally transformed Germany into an increasingly militarized state, where professional generals governed in practice, establishing what historians would later term a silent dictatorship. In 1916, with the appointment of Hindenburg as chief of the General Staff and Ludendorff as his first quartermaster general, effectively creating a military duumvirate, it became abundantly clear that Wilhelm II no longer possessed any meaningful voice in decision-making processes. The emperor, who had once jealously centralized power in his own hands and dismissed Bismarck to rule personally, now observed helplessly and impotently as the military leadership directed the country with increasingly aggressive, unrestricted policies. These included the fateful decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, which would ultimately provoke American entry into the war. The conflict, which Wilhelm had originally imagined and publicly promised, would result in a swift, decisive victory, culminating in a triumphant peace dictated in Paris, dragged on for years with no end in sight. The war systematically exhausted the German economy, depleted the nation's material and human resources, and progressively undermined the morale and spirit of the civilian population, who suffered through severe food shortages, economic hardship, and mounting casualty lists. Throughout the increasingly bleak years of the war, Wilhelm began to isolate himself physically and psychologically at the Imperial General Headquarters in Spa, Belgium, deliberately distancing himself from the harsh reality of conditions in Berlin and from the severe difficulties, deprivations, and growing unrest that the German people endured daily. He continued to deliver periodic nationalist speeches filled with bombastic rhetoric, urging the population to remain steadfast and resist the enemy coalition until final victory. However, His actual influence over the development and conduct of the war had become practically non-existent. The German people increasingly viewed him as disconnected from their suffering. The military high command made all substantive decisions without consulting him, or even informing him in advance of major operations. By late 1918, Germany stood on the precipice of complete collapse. After 4 years of an exhausting, devastating war that had consumed an entire generation, the country faced crushing military defeats on the Western Front, severe food shortages that left the civilian population malnourished and desperate, and increasingly violent internal revolts that threatened to tear the nation apart. The entry of the United States into the conflict in 1917 had decisively tipped the balance of power in favor of the Allies, making German defeat not merely probable, but inevitable. While Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who had dominated German military and political strategy for years, privately admitted that the war was irretrievably lost and that Germany must seek an armistice on whatever terms it could obtain, Wilhelm II remained in profound denial. He stubbornly refused to accept the grim reality of Germany's military situation. However, the empire that he had governed with such pride and imperial pretension for 3 decades was crumbling around him. His own fate was no longer in his hands, but subject to forces beyond his control. The internal situation within Germany deteriorated with alarming rapidity. In November 1918, widespread revolts erupted simultaneously in several major cities, with mutinous sailors in Kiel, exhausted soldiers at the front, and radicalized workers in industrial centers openly refusing to continue fighting what they increasingly viewed as a senseless war. The German Revolution gathered unstoppable momentum. Workers and soldiers, councils, seized control of local governments throughout the country. The Social Democratic Party, which had long represented the working class and now held significant parliamentary power, began exerting intense pressure for the emperor to abdicate immediately as an essential precondition for negotiating an armistice with the Allies and preventing further bloodshed. Meanwhile, Wilhelm remained at the Imperial General Headquarters in Spa, Belgium, physically and psychologically isolated from events in Germany. He failed to comprehend or perhaps refused to acknowledge the true gravity of the existential crisis engulfing his empire. He still naively believed that he could rally loyal troops, particularly elite units commanded by aristocratic officers, to march on Berlin and ruthlessly crush the revolutionary movements. However, the military establishment, including officers who had once sworn personal loyalty to the Kaiser, no longer supported him or his increasingly delusional plans for maintaining power. The final devastating blow arrived on November 9, 1918, when Chancellor Prince Maximilian von Baden, acting on his own authority and under enormous pressure from social democratic leaders who threatened to withdraw their support for an orderly transition, publicly announced Wilhelm's abdication without obtaining his consent or even informing him in advance. The emperor, upon learning through telegraph that his title and throne had been stripped from him without his knowledge or approval, erupted in rage and indignation. He denounced the announcement as an act of betrayal and treason. However, there was nothing he could realistically do to reverse the situation or reclaim his position. That same momentous day, the German Republic was formally proclaimed from a balcony of the Reichstag building in Berlin by Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann. The imperial government, which had ruled Germany since unification in 1871, ceased to exist. Betrayed by his own generals who had concluded he was a political liability, abandoned by the Prussian nobility, who had once formed the backbone of monarchical support, and rejected by a war-weary population that blamed him for their suffering, Wilhelm finally comprehended that his only remaining option was immediate flight into exile to avoid potential arrest, trial, or worse, at the hands of revolutionary forces. Following his abdication in November 1918, Wilhelm II found refuge in the Netherlands, where he received political asylum from Queen Wilhelmina, who granted him protection despite considerable international pressure to extradite the former emperor for trial as a war criminal. He established himself in the small-town quiet town of Dorn, in a modest country estate called Huis-Dorn, where he would spend the remaining 23 years of his life in permanent exile. Far removed from the magnificent palaces of Berlin and from the vast imperial power he had once wielded over millions of subjects, Wilhelm attempted to maintain an image of imperial dignity and aristocratic bearing. However, his political influence had utterly vanished. The former Kaiser passed his days writing self-serving memoirs that sought to absolve himself of responsibility. Meticulously practicing gardening and chopping wood as therapeutic activities, and receiving a steadily diminishing number of loyal visitors from his former court, he constantly attempted to justify his downfall by blaming others. He worked tirelessly to rewrite his own historical legacy in more favorable terms. Throughout the 1920s, Wilhelm harbored profound and bitter resentment against the Weimar Republic, which he viewed as an illegitimate government imposed by traitors and enemies. He blamed socialists, Jews, and the British for Germany's defeat in the First World War, subscribing to the emerging stab-in-the-back myth that falsely claimed the German military had been betrayed by the home front rather than genuinely defeated on the battlefield. He adamantly refused to accept any personal responsibility for the catastrophic collapse of the empire or for the disastrous policies that had led Germany into an unwinnable war. He considered the new democratic German government fundamentally illegitimate and unworthy of governing the German nation. Despite these strong feelings, he deliberately avoided direct involvement in active politics, maintaining a public distance from the tumultuous events that were dramatically reshaping post-war Germany. However, with the meteoric rise of the Nazi Party throughout the 1930s and their increasing electoral success, his attitude and posture began to shift noticeably. Wilhelm initially viewed Adolf Hitler as a potentially useful instrument for restoring German glory and perhaps even monarchical power. He harbored serious reservations about Hitler's crude populist style, his working-class origins, and the revolutionary nature of the Nazi regime, which fundamentally challenged traditional aristocratic values. Initially, Hitler and his propagandists attempted to strategically exploit the symbolic image of the exiled Kaiser to attract monarchists, traditional conservatives, and nostalgic Germans to the Nazi movement, presenting themselves as continuators of German imperial greatness. Wilhelm expressed genuine appreciation for the Third Reich's early military victories, including the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, and the conquest of France. He saw in Hitler's aggressive expansionist foreign policy a clear echo of his own frustrated imperial ambitions and his vision of German dominance in Europe. Nevertheless, despite occasional hints and suggestions, he was never formally invited to return to Germany. The monarchy was never restored or even seriously considered by Nazi leadership. Gradually and reluctantly, Wilhelm came to understand that the Führer had absolutely no intention of returning power to the Hohenzollern family or of sharing authority with any potential rival institution. Furthermore, despite his fervent German nationalism and his anti-Semitic prejudices, Wilhelm increasingly despised the vulgar, lower-class character of Nazism. He felt deeply uncomfortable with its systematic brutality, the thuggish behavior of SA stormtroopers, and the movement's complete lack of traditional aristocratic codes of honor and noblesse oblige. With the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939, Wilhelm II still harbored unrealistic hopes that a decisive German victory might somehow create conditions favorable to the restoration of the monarchy, perhaps with Hitler stepping aside after achieving his territorial objectives. However, as the conflict progressed relentlessly and Hitler consolidated his absolute totalitarian domination over every aspect of German society and government, it became painfully clear that there was no conceivable place for the Hohenzollerns in the new radical order. In May 1940, when German forces invaded and rapidly conquered the Netherlands, occupying the country where Wilhelm had found sanctuary, Hitler extended a calculated offer for the former Kaiser to return to Germany under his personal protection. Likely intending to use him for propaganda purposes, Wilhelm firmly rejected this offer. He preferred to remain in Dorn rather than become a puppet of the Nazi regime. Wilhelm II died on June 4, 1941, at the age of 82, without ever having returned to his beloved Germany or witnessed the restoration of the monarchy he had lost. In his carefully prepared testament, He explicitly expressed his wish not to be buried on German soil until the monarchy was formally restored to the Hohenzollern dynasty. His body remained at Huisdoorn in the Netherlands. He rests there to this day in a modest mausoleum on the estate grounds, a forgotten relic of a vanished imperial age, his dreams of restoration never realized, and his historical legacy forever tarnished by his role in precipitating the First World War. The legacy of Wilhelm II remains one of the most intensely debated and contested in modern history. He was not merely the last emperor of Germany, but also one of the most controversial and consequential leaders of the 20th century, whose actions fundamentally shaped the course of global events. His chronic impulsivity, lack of diplomatic finesse, and uncontrolled personal ambition contributed directly and substantially to the diplomatic isolation of Germany and to the outbreak of the catastrophic First World War. By abruptly breaking with Bismarck's carefully constructed diplomatic system and adopting an aggressively confrontational foreign policy characterized by naval expansion, colonial demands, and repeated international crises, he systematically dismantled crucial strategic alliances that had maintained European stability. He created escalating tensions across the continent. These policies ultimately plunged Europe into unprecedented chaos and devastation that claimed millions of lives. Wilhelm II was an emperor fundamentally driven by excessive pride, persistent recklessness, and an insatiable, pathological need for affirmation and recognition that stemmed from deep-seated personal insecurities rooted in his physical disability and troubled relationship with his parents. His government began in 1888 with grandiose promises of imperial glory, unprecedented power, and Germany's rightful place as a dominant world power surpassing even the British Empire. However, it ended in ignominious exile, political irrelevance, and historical infamy. Was he a visionary leader unfairly judged by history, or simply an incompetent, emotionally unstable monarch who recklessly accelerated the collapse of his own empire through poor judgment and impulsive decision-making? If he had acted with greater caution, diplomatic restraint, and strategic wisdom, maintaining Bismarck's alliance system and avoiding needless provocations, could the First World War have been prevented or at least postponed? These questions continue to preoccupy historians and spark scholarly debate. Now I want to know your opinion on this complex historical figure. Do you believe Wilhelm II was primarily a victim of circumstances beyond his control, caught in the grip of forces like nationalism, militarism, and alliance systems that made war inevitable? Or was he the principal architect and primary culprit responsible for the disaster that followed, whose personal failures of leadership directly caused one of history's greatest catastrophes? Leave your comment below and share your perspective on this controversial emperor. If you want to continue exploring the most impactful, fascinating moments of history and discover the stories of other influential figures who shaped our world, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you never miss new content. Don't miss our upcoming videos, because the past always has profound lessons to teach us about leadership, power, and the consequences of our choices.